Hello and welcome to this video where we're explaining how to use Conan 2.0 to improve your C++ toolset and make your builds a lot easier. So let's get straight into it. So first of all, what is Conan and how does it help you? Well, Conan is actually a C++ package manager, and if you don't know what a package manager is, it's just a tool that helps you manage the packages in your software and make them easier to include and export. So in essence, Conan just helps you bring in third-party libraries into your project. Now, why should you use Conan? Well, Conan actually makes it easier for you to include third-party packages, such as, for example, like OpenCV, OpenSSL, the FMT library, or any sort of library that you can think of that it's like quite widely used in C++. And all you really have to do is to write a basic Conan recipe where you basically declare the libraries that you want to consume from your project, and Conan will download them, will build them, and then also package them so you can include them in your CMake, Visual Studio, or Maven project, however you like it. And it makes things a lot easier if you compare to, for example, manually including these packages where you have to like go on the Git repository and download the source code yourself, like build a particular library, for example, Google Tests in your platform, and then sort of make those headers available to your build by copying them somewhere, as well as the libraries necessary, and having to write like extra CMake, that's the most important thing, the extra build system instructions to actually include that library. So Conan kind of gets rid of most of the manual work there, and all you really have to do is to say which packages you want to include in a project, and you'll download, build them, and make them available to your CMake project, which is, very, very nice compared to the alternatives out there. So the very first thing to know is that Conan is written in Python, so the entire tool is written in Python, which means that you may need Python in your system to use it. Although in Conan 2.0, I think they're actually packaging the tool itself with the Python interpreter, so you don't actually need to have the system Python installed. So secondly, and perhaps most importantly, Conan actually works by having, many different what we call recipes, which are essentially just Conan scripts or Python scripts that tell Conan, the tool, how to download the package, how to build a package, and how to, package a package in a way that, the users of Conan can just easily integrate it with their build systems. So the actual main repo for that, if you're interested, is called Conan Center Index. And if you go into recipes, there will be a massive list of all the available recipes in Conan. So for example, I can see at the top here, there was 7-zip that you can kind of include in your in your program if you want. However, you can make this even easier by just going to the Conan Center, and if you type in conan.io/center, you get the search bar where you can search for any libraries that are available on the Conan remote. So for example, OpenCV will be here. If I just search for that, you can see that OpenCV is available, and you can in fact install OpenCV with Conan. That's what it means. Now, going a little bit deeper into the actual model of Conan, it kind of works by creating what we call a unique package ID for every package that you consume in your project. So for example, if I included OpenCV, it wouldn't just build OpenCV once. It might build it 2, 3, or even, however many times I change certain settings, because each package ID is essentially a new build for that package. And for illustration, you can see here like what it may look like. So like math.1, it will have like an ID associated to it. And this ID is calculated by, a combination of different things, such as the options for the package that you're using. Like you can have a shared flag enabled or disabled if you want to build the library in shared mode or not, or static. But it also takes in your system settings into account, such as like your build architecture, your build type, release debug, and of course things like compiler version, etc. And then for each one of these IDs generated, it will actually build the package and make the package available for your build system to be included. And you can find out more about this if you actually go to the Conan documentation. There is an entire page explaining how these package IDs are calculated. There's also a very good video by one of the Conan founders here, which is on the What's New page in Conan, the very first one here, which explains the differences between Conan 1 and Conan 2, which essentially just means, that there are quite a few differences in the way the package is calculated. But I think it's worth watching that if you're actually interested in using Conan, maybe for your personal projects or your workplace, I don't know. Another thing is that, for every package ID that it kind of generates from your package configuration. So for example, if you're including zlib, as it shows here, and your particular configuration generates a zlib package ID of this one here, it will not necessarily build it from source again every time you include it, because you might actually have built that exact same configuration before and it's in your Conan local cache. Or likewise, it might also be available in the Conan remote. So someone else somewhere in the world might have built the same configuration and uploaded it to the Conan remote. So Conan does download, it caches the binaries and downloads it. So it's a very good tool for sort of like caching, dependency builds, which is kind of one of the reasons why I use it. I'm not sure if VC Package has the feature yet, but they were talking about including it a few months ago. I actually need to check back. But Conan does have the binary caching capability, so it is a very good tool if you're trying to do that, so not waste as much time building things. So just to summarize, if a package you have included with Conan is already in your cache, it will not build it. If a package you've included in your project with Conan is on the remote, already built with the same sort of like settings, it will also not build it, it will just download it from the remote. However, if a package you include has something different, so if you've changed just a single option in the package, or you change the compiler or the compiler version, Conan will rebuild that from source and then store it locally, okay? And before we start looking at an example of a Conan recipe to include packages, I want to actually just talk a little bit about the integrations. So Conan isn't just meant to be used with CMake. You can actually use it with things like CLion. There is a plugin for it, Visual Studio, without the need of CMake in between. There's also other like Makefile, Mason build integrations. So, Conan should work for all these build systems, which, as far as I can tell, is like the most popular build systems out there. So unless you're using something very, very obscure, you should be able to use Conan with whatever build system generator you're used to. I'm going to just quickly talk about 3 ways you can install it here. So the first method, and probably the most recommended one, if you have a recent version of Python 3 installed, you can use the pip installer, so the pip package manager. So you can just do a pip install Conan, and it should install one of the latest versions of Conan, which at the minute is 2.0.13. And you can also use pipx with the same sort of command here. Instead, you've just replaced this with pipx if you want to use something that's not going to mess up your distro if you're on Linux. Now, on the Windows side, one of the ways I prefer to install like independent open source packages is through Chocolatey. So Chocolatey is sort of like what Conan is to C++, but for Windows. It's just a package manager where you can install tools from the command line. So Chocolatey does actually have support for Conan as a community package, and at the moment it is also 2.0.13. And this is actually how I installed it in this machine. Or if you're a Windows Power user and you actually have Winget, you can also use Winget to install Conan as well. So Winget doesn't seem to be as up to date with the versions as Chocolatey and pip, but you can still get Conan 2.0.2 here, and this is the command you can do here. So those are the 3 different ways you can install Conan in your machine. Now let's take a look at some Conanfile examples. And the Conanfile is essentially a file that you need to have in your project directory somewhere, that will essentially say like which packages you're consuming, which options for each packages you have, and then maybe even some settings for your system. So there are 2 ways you could write a Conanfile. So the most basic one, and this is not something I personally recommend, is to use a conanfile.txt file, right? So you can have a conanfile.txt in your root project, and this txt file, I believe, is just a toml file which just declares the packages that you want to include in your project. So an example here, and if we go down a little bit more, we see that we have a requires section, and this section says that we need the Poco library version 1.9.4, as well as the zlib 1.3.12. So how would you know kind of like what you put for a particular package here? And this is kind of going back to the Conan Center. If you just search for OpenCV, the page for the OpenCV, let me allow the cookies here, will actually say what you need here for the conanfile.txt. They tend to give you an example of what you need. So in the case of OpenCV, you just copy and paste this into your conanfile.txt. Another section that you probably should include as well is the generators. So the generators section kind of just says like how you intend to use Conan. So if you're using CMake, you pretty much need these 2 here. So like you want to include the CMake toolchain and the CMake dependencies. So the CMake dependencies is what's going to tell Conan to generate the sort of like find files or the config files for each package. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. And the CMake toolchain file is going to create the Conan toolchain.cmake file that you can just include in your Conan commands. You can read more about this on this documentation page. I'm not going to go over every single detail of this because it's freely available out there, and I'll leave all the links in the description so you can check it all out. But what I can say is that I actually recommend not using the conanfile.txt because you can't actually have any sort of logic in it. You can't say, for example, if I'm building on on Windows, I want to include this version of a package, and if I'm building on Linux, I want to include this other version of a package. Or if you want to include extra libraries per system, for example, on Linux you want to include an extra dependency somewhere, you can't really do that in the Conanfile, but you can do that in the Conanfile.py. And the Conanfile.py is essentially just the Python version of the Conanfile. Let's take a look at that right now. So this is actually a Conanfile for one of the projects that I've been sort of like working on the stream recently. I think this is for the audio visualizer. So if you're interested in creating an audio visualizer, check out my live streams. There will be like quite a few of them up there already. But this is what I created for it. And essentially what you need to have in that Python file is just something like this. You need to have a class with the name of your project. And it doesn't really matter which name it is. As far as I know, you can have, anything here. But that class has to inherit from the Conanfile, which comes from the Conan library here. And then obviously inside that class, you can override a lot of things. And I'm talking about, a lot of things. There is a whole documentation page on it. And let's see if we can get it here. So if you go to conanfile.py, you can see here that, you can see all the attributes and all the methods. There's, a whole documentation page explaining exactly which methods you have to sort of override if you want to do a certain thing. So I'm not going to go too much into detail here. You can look at the documentation yourself, but I will say what I recommend if you're just using the conanfile.py to just include some third-party packages in your project. So I would recommend you writing the generators. As I said, it does integrate into other IDEs and other build systems. You just have to look at the integrations here. For example, Visual Studio. If you're using Visual Studio and you want to integrate with that, you basically just have to kind of use whatever MS build dependencies it tells you to do here instead of these two values. But I'm going to assume that we're all using CMake just for the sake of illustration here. So yeah, define the generators, which is either a list or a tuple of generators you want Conan to use. And the settings that actually matter for your build, and these aren't the settings that you would be setting necessarily for this build. These are the settings that Conan will be looking at in order to generate that package ID. So these are the settings that will tell Conan when to basically change that package ID. So like we care about the OS, we care about the build type, we care about the architecture, and we care about the compiler for this particular project. So if any of these things change, we're going to basically relook at all the dependencies and see if any of them needs to be rebuilt. Now, obviously, this one is the most important method that you have to override, and it's just called requirements. This is where you actually list all the libraries that you want to use, you want Conan to download for your project. So in my case here, I'm using a library called audiophile, which is for reading wave files. Broadly here, I'm not going to explain about this override just yet. We are using FMT as well for text formatting, and most importantly Qt, which is quite a big library. It's a huge library. So it's just to show how versatile Conan is. It can work with libraries such as Qt, OpenCV, and Boost. So what we're including here, this is actually a funny one because this is a version range. You can have a version range in both the text and the Python file, and I'm just saying that I want Qt more than or equals to 6.5, but definitely less than 6.6, right? So 6.5.x is what I'm saying here, right? So you can have something like this as well. Now, if you've noticed, I left out this broadly requirement here because it has an override equals true. So why am I doing that here? So this is obviously something that Conan supports in the requires function when you call it here. And sometimes, in some cases, very, very rarely, I would say, where two or more dependencies of your project depend on the same sort of like library. So in this case, I think two dependencies of Qt, I can't remember which ones they were. They both depend on this broadly library, but one of them depended on broadly 1.0.9 and the other one depended on 1.1.0, and there was a conflict there. So Conan said, we can't build this because we have the same dependency but two different versions. And this is why you have to override something. And if that happens to you, so if you have a dependency conflict where the major version is kind of the same, but the minor version changes slightly, I would say just go for the biggest minor version. So in my case, 1.1 was definitely bigger than 1.0.9. So I went for 1.1 and I set override equals true. And that should solve that dependency. And hopefully you're not going to get any compilation issues. But if you do get compilation issues, you're going to have to raise an issue in the Conan Center repository. So just a little point on version conflicts, which do happen in Conan as well as, any other package manager out there. Now, the second other method that I would definitely recommend overriding in this class here is the build requirements which just tells Conan which tools that you basically need to build your project. So in my project, I want to make sure that whoever's building this project here and all these dependencies has CMake at least version 3.25. The reason for that is, C3.25 does seem to support modules in C++, and I will be switching to modules at some point in the future in this project. So I want to make sure that whoever's building this actually has support to that, and hence why I want CMake 3.25. So what happens if the user building this doesn't actually have 3.25? Well, they will get a very nice error in Conan saying that they don't have the the CMake requirement here. I'm not entirely sure whether Conan will try and download CMake 3.25. I think it just prints out an error, but I'll have to double check that. Either way, it's good explicitly saying which CMake version you need, which Mason version you need. I don't know, whatever you're using as a tool to build your project, you should probably include it here as well. And again, there is extensive documentation on the Conan page, so you can see how this method works and what kind of stuff you can actually include here. So moving on from the build requirements, I will say that if you're building anything very complex, any library that's very complex, such as Qt, such as OpenCV, such as Boost, for example, where those libraries actually have sort of like sub-modules that don't necessarily get built with the default configurations. So for example, Qt has a multimedia module. So if you're building this manually, you have to set an extra flag on the CMake build for Qt. So if there's anything like that and the Conan recipe supports that, you should probably define those settings inside the configure method. So in my case here, as you can see, I'm actually building Qt here as a static library because I'm on Windows and I didn't really want to have any dependencies on the MSVC runtime. And I'm also, as I said, building that Qt multimedia module, and this is kind of how you do it here. So you just put those options inside the configure. So yeah, I mean, if you're doing anything like that where you're providing extra options to dependencies, you should probably have a configure method in your Conanfile.py as well. And this last one here is not necessarily needed. So this is basically where you can change where your files will be generated to, and we'll look at that in a second. Now, obviously there are extra things you can do with the Conanfile. These are just a very, very small subset of the actual methods and functionality that you can have in a Conanfile.py. There are many, many more attributes and methods that you can override in that Conanfile, and it's all in the documentation. So make sure that you check this out, at least if you want to do something extra. For example, there are ways you can copy necessary DLLs from a dependency to your build directory if you need them. So Qt is actually quite a good example of that, because you have the Qt runtime or the Qt plugins DLLs that you have to copy on Windows, or DSO files that you have to copy on Linux, and you'll be doing that in a Conanfile as well. There are many, many examples of these things online when you Google them. I'm not going to go over them here because it's not really necessary for the example, but just to know that these are things you can do with Conan, and it's very flexible in that sense. Now, once it's installed, how do you actually use Conan to download all this stuff here? So first of all, let's just note that I've got the Conanfile in my on my root directory here. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the root directory, but I like to put my Conanfile in the root directory with my CMake lists, just so people can see, these are the dependencies that I'm going to use for this project very clearly. And the command that I particularly use is Conan install, and then you have to point it to where your Conanfile is, and this is just in this directory, so I'm going to just put a dot here, and the rest goes kind of like this. So you have you definitely need the build missing here, and this option just says that Conan should build whatever package you don't have locally or in the remote available to you. And this goes back to what I said about the package IDs and how if a package ID is missing, it will build it. So this is just saying that if you don't already have a package ID available to you somehow, it's going to build it from source. You can also pass in different settings to Conan. As you can see here, I've got a -s build type I'm setting to debug in this particular case, because by default, as you will see in my profile in a second, it will build in release. So in the command line, you can also set, very peculiar things such as where the Conan generated files will reside. In my case, it's going to be in Conan/debug, and you see that in a second. And I could in fact run this right now, and it would run for me, but chances are when you run this, it's not going to work out of the box because you don't have a Conan profile. So a Conan profile is a Conan file that basically just says what the defaults are for your system, what the default settings are. So which compilers you have, which platform you're on, what is your architecture, what is the default build type, and so on and so forth. Now, in my case, I already generated one, and again, it usually resides in the Conan directory, so in .conan2 under your profile directory. I don't know where that is for you. And if you look at profiles after that, in my case, you can see here that I've got one called default. And if I cut it out, if I cut default with it, you can see what it kind of looks like. And it's just, again, like a TOML file, I guess, with some very basic settings. So in my particular case, the default settings for my machine are, architecture x86 64. The build type is by default release, and hence why I changed it in the command before. The compiler is MSVC because I am on a Windows device and I've got the Visual Studio compilers installed. And the C++ standard by default for me is 17. And this is a setting that's only really relevant on Windows. So like the runtime for your, I guess, compiler, whether it's a static or dynamic. So this kind of represents, static is the MT version of the MSVC runtime library, if you know what that is. And dynamic is the other one, so MD, I think, so dynamically linked. Also the compiler version, it detects that for you, and the OS is Windows. Now this is something that Conan actually detected for me. And how did I do that? Well, you can do a Conan profile detect here, and once you do that, Conan is going to save this file exactly where it is here. So in your home directory, -Conan and profiles after that, and it'll be a file called just default. In my case, it didn't work because it already exists. But I will say that if there's anything that you think is wrong, so for example, if you want the build type to be debug by default, you can't edit this file and then just put a debug here. You just got to make sure that the value actually matches what's allowed on Conan. And again, you can see that on the documentation that I'll post on the description. So a very common case is like you're doing this on Windows and you've got GCC and Clang, and you'd like to build everything with Clang by default, but the Conan profile detect actually detected GCC, and you can change those things manually. You can change the compiler to Clang, and then the version, just got to make sure that the major version matches, and everything will be fine. Okay, so this is the file that you need to have there. So only when you have all these things in places, profile and your recipe fully written and working fine, can you run the Conan install command, which is this one here. So in my case now, so as you can see here, I'm actually overriding the settings in my profile where the build type is going to be debug and not release. And I'm also saying that all the files, the output folder should be conan.debug. Okay. And of course, if I do that, since everything is already, cached, as you can see here, Conan does have a very helpful way to say which libraries are being sort of downloaded or used from the cache or downloaded, or which ones have been built. And I've already built all of these before because it would take quite a long time. Since I'm actually pulling Qt here, it takes like maybe half an hour to build the entire thing on my machine. But once it's done, you can look at your Conan directory, which is where I told Conan to put all the files. And there's a debug, and I've got everything in here, including the Conan toolchain.cmake, as well as all the config files for each of my dependencies. Okay, so it's quite a lot of files. So do make sure that you put all these files generated somewhere that's not your main repository, because it will mess things up. Since everything just worked just fine, actually using these generated files is very easy. So in my case here, you can see that in my CMake presets, I have an extra variable here, which is the CMake toolchain file for my CMake command, and I'm just setting it to be, what was actually wrong here, just setting it to be Conan/debug Conan toolchain.cmake, right? So CMake is essentially going to use whatever it's in Conan debug Conan toolchain as the toolchain file here, and this is how it finds all the dependencies for you. And that's obviously not everything. There is a little bit more you have to write. So if you're not using a CMake presets.json, you can just include this sort of like command line arguments to CMake. So -d CMake toolchain file equals whatever the path to the Conan toolchain file is. So in your CMake command line, so wherever you have to include a particular library in your CMake. So for example, I'm using Qt everywhere here. You have to do a find package and then the name of the package required here. So this particular line here will include that Qt6 that comes from Conan, the Conan toolchain, in my project, right? When I do a configuration here, so when I delete the cache and reconfigure, you can see that CMake actually says that all my Qt modules are found here. And very interestingly, I also have the multimedia, which is the extra option that I build Qt with here. And yeah, that's it really. I mean, you can link your executables, your libraries against the target that was declared here. So if I wanted to, for example, create an executable, as I do have an example here somewhere, if I look at my audio visualizer and I want to link it against the Qt multimedia, I just have to say something like this: target link libraries, your name of the target, so visualizer, and then Qt6 or Qt6 multimedia here. in the same sort of like spelling as it says here on the Conan output, okay? And then just before we finish this video, I just want to talk about CI a little bit. So Conan is actually very, very easy to include in your CI, because in essence, all you need to do in your CI is have a Conan installed in your Docker image or whatever container you're using in your CI. So make sure that your Docker image has Conan installed either through pip or chocolatey or any sort of package manager out there. Have to create maybe a script or a simple command line to download those Conan dependencies before you build, right? Because you have to download and build the dependencies before you actually build your software. And then from that, you just have to make sure that you include that the CMake toolchain and point it to the Conan toolchain file, as I showed you before, and it should just be included in the CI for you. I do have an example of a continuous integration pipeline here on one of my Git repositories where I do actually use Conan. Yeah, I will leave the link to the description here, but you can sort of like see Azure pipelines.yaml file here on how things happen. If you look and if you just search for Conan, you can see that I have, first of all, an image that contains Conan, and you can obviously use this in your own CIs. You just have to include this image name here. But also there are some jobs where I'm actually, building, installing the Conan stuff, the Conan dependencies, right? But yeah, I tried to make this video very short, and I do hope that you liked it and you learned something. If you are interested in Conan, do check out the documentation, make sure it's the right tool for you. One more thing, if you haven't done it yet, please give a like to the video and also subscribe to the channel, because the more subscribers I have, the more motivation I have to post videos like this. But very recently as well, I've been doing quite a lot of live streams where I basically get to learn something with you guys and get to chat with you live. So do check those out as well. And I'm going to leave the video here. I hope you guys really enjoyed it, and bye-bye.